Hi, friends. I have great news. I can't wait to share this episode's conversation where we get to talk with John Dyer, who is an expert in technology and theology. And I'm delighted to share that John will be joining us in Kansas City on October 28th for an event about artificial intelligence. That's right, AI. So save that date. Again, it's October 28th, 2024, and you can go to cckc.church/AI to get all the details.
But I do think it's instructive, too, that as we move along and we get to Jesus, that Jesus is the one who has created us in his image, right? All things were made through the Son. And yet when he comes to earth, that we, the creation, turn on the creator, just literally we don't accept him. And then also that the technology with which he worked, wood and nails, is the very technology on which he dies. Mm-hmm. And so there at the center of the story is not this abstract idea or principle, but is, human making and human being right there in the middle of the story. And when we tell the gospel story, we can't tell it, but without this tool in the middle of it, the cross. We even sing songs about the old wooden cross, that it's so symbolically powerful to us.
Whether it delights you, terrifies you, or both, there is no going back. We now inhabit a world increasingly being shaped by generative artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this is just the latest in a long string of technological developments, from the steam engine to personal computing to smartphones, that influence how we live every day. So how should we as Christians think about technology theologically? That's what we talk about today on the theFormed.life podcast. Dr. John Dyer joins us today to give us a framework for this conversation. And John is uniquely qualified to help us here. He studied biochemistry and genetics at Texas A&M. He once had a patent on a molecule. He earned a master's in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, where he works and teaches, and has a PhD in sociology of religion from Durham University. He has also earned his living as a coder, creating tools like bestcommentaries.com, BibleWebApp.com, YALLversion.com, Worship.ai, and other open source tools used by companies including Apple, WordPress, Microsoft, and the Department of Defense. Let's jump into the conversation now.
Well, John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the theFormed.life podcast today.
Well, thank you all for having me.
Yeah, it's a joy to be with you. And we mentioned before we started recording that I was first introduced to your work over a decade ago. The first edition of your book, From the Garden to the City, came out all the way back in 2011, and writing about this idea of technology, this topic of technology. And I'm really interested and fascinated in your specific story in the midst of that. So if you're willing, I'd love to ask to start there. Just, can you share more? How did you come to get invested in thinking and studying and eventually writing about technology and its impact on us as humans? What's your story in that arena?
Yeah, that's a great question. I, like a lot of people in my kind of age group, 40s or so, grew up, with a home computer and that kind of thing. And then when the internet came on in the early 90s, thought, well, this is just neat, but it was off to the side. But it wasn't until after I graduated from college, I was a youth pastor, wasn't making enough money doing that I thought, I know just enough to get into a web job. And I thought, I just wanted to figure out how to, use stuff for God's glory. Don't do bad stuff, do good stuff. And I hadn't really thought about it a ton. But, you think back to like 2006, 7, 8, kind of that time frame of like Twitter and Facebook and iPhones and so social media, and then glowing rectangles in our pockets. Yeah. We're all starting to go, something's happening here. And I think I had always just thought of, as long as I'm using it for good, not for bad, there's not much more I need to think about. And something about that moment started to make me realize, like, even just using this at all has some type of formative impact on us. And so I had some, a professor or two in classes kind of challenge me, and that really got me thinking about what it was that I was doing, both in my personal life with phones and stuff, but also in my professional life of making things. What is the kind of ethical and theological ways I need to be thinking about this? And then how do I take all this great stuff that there's all this scholarship out there I didn't know existed? How do I make that accessible to people like me that just like to code?
That's awesome. That's fascinating. Yeah.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I'm just curious, when you say code, is that something you went to college for? Did you do computer science or that kind of, or is that something you just kind of taught yourself?
Yeah, really self-taught. I didn't get to take any classes or any of that sort of stuff. I did a pre-med background. That's really the direction I wanted to go. My dad was a doctor and thought that would be the way to go. And I think even, maybe in like my high school days, I wanted to be cool, and computers weren't cool then,
Yeah, right.
And so it was always this sort of underground thing. And, but it wasn't until I just really figured out, I just love making stuff. So I love making cupcakes. I love making code stuff. I love making stuff with wood. So I love anything that helps me generate or make something. And so I just eventually found my way into that, just wanting to make my own little website, and then figured out, man, I could actually do a little bit of a career on this. But yeah, it was all kind of self-taught. Like, I think they often say, like, the best way to code is to code angry. And what we mean by that is, like, if you have a problem you want to solve, you'll figure it out. Just going to, if you take the class, it just feels like a class. But if you've got something you want to do, man, you're motivated to do it. And that's really how I started and have always continued to do now. So
that's fascinating.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and even mentioning the cupcakes and making stuff out of wood and making stuff out of code brings us even to step back a little bit in this conversation and just say, I think when we use the language of technology, we often think of coding, digital technology, glowing rectangles,
computers, phones,
but technology is really broader than that. And there's certain elements of technology that are going into baking those cupcakes or working in the wood shop or those kinds of things. So I'm just even curious, as we kind of are at the front of this conversation, how would you define technology? When we use that language, we often think digital technology, but it's bigger than that. So just how do you think about technology and define technology?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways you could go with that. I think the average person, like you said, is probably thinking of some internet-connected screen. That's kind of what they're generally thinking of when you use technology. If we step back and we do like the linguistics and all that stuff, I want to do that in a second. But one definition I love is from Alan Kay. He's the guy that invented the mouse. And his definition is technology is anything invented after you were born.
I've heard that before, yeah.
Yeah, so all of us kind of think of just the stuff that was around when we were born. That's just the way the world is.
Yeah.
And then Douglas Adams, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe guy, he would say everything before you're born is just stuff. Everything from 0 to 30 is the cool, amazing stuff you can build a career on. And then everything after 30 is the destruction of society and the degradation of our kids' minds. So we just react these ways.
Isn't that true, though? I mean, he's nailed it, right?
Exactly.
Didn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, broadly, if we want to like switch gears into Bible, Jesus gets called this word tectone. So he is a tectone.
Whoa.
And Paul is also he practices a particular kind of techne. So techne is this artisan or craftsmanship, and then tectone is an artisan or a craftsperson, someone who makes something. And so we think that the kind of artisan or craftsperson that Jesus was a carpenter, because that's what the way that word gets translated, because we know that's the best guess. And then we know Paul was a tent maker. That was his techne. So it turns out back in that sort of Greek day that an artisan or craftsperson could be anything. I mean, they could be someone that was painting things, someone who was a stone worker, all that sort of stuff. And then you see probably 500-600 years ago that this term starts to be a little bit more machine oriented. That there's like the physical arts, and then there's more the fine arts, of things like painting and sculpture. But then there's the mechanical arts, and then that when MIT and schools like that, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Technology was in that day meant something more like learning how to make stuff. So technology was the knowledge of making stuff. And so eventually the word technology becomes the stuff itself. And that was, physical machines, and now it's like digital machines. So that's like the brief history version of it. But when we think about it that way, we can think about how much of our lives is shaped by some form of technology. Even, for example, that mega churches are formed by two technologies, cars and microphones. And we don't think of those as being these radical determiners of how church works, but really that enables a whole new church model, right? It enables something that's big enough that we can have missionaries be sent out from a church rather than a collection of churches. So we want to be thinking about all of those things and how they're forming the ways, the kinds of lives that we live and the kinds of families that we live, how our community structures work, all that sort of stuff. And then we also want to use it in the normal way that most people do, which is, internet connected screens.
Yeah.
Do you have a kind of succinct definition that you've used in some of your writing and thinking about this, or something to kind of try to capture all that you're describing there?
Yeah, so I think that I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah,
but what I often will do is talk a little bit about tools and devices and even processes that we use to transform the world. something like that. And so when I'm using all those terms, so I do want to make this distinction between kind of older tools and then modern devices. So we talk a little bit about that, and I think the newer edition of my book spends some more time on that, just so that we think about how a shovel might form us in a different way than a device or a screen might form us. And then to also use technology as some type of process. It's a way of doing things, even like we have ways of discipleship or something like that, that we have ways that we operate and that we do large-scale projects. And in a sense, all of them are trying to do this transformative action in some way. Now we could theologize that a little bit, of saying transforming, God's creation into a direction that we want to go, but something like that I think would be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and in a class about theology and technology that you teach at Dallas Theological Seminary, we went and looked kind of one of the ways you organize the material, 3 big buckets for technology, and kind of helping this class: frames, faithfulness, and futures. So I wonder if you could, for our listeners, share a little bit about what you mean by each of those. As preachers, we really love that there was 3 and that they all started with the same letter. So you're right on track for us. But why have you landed on that as an overarching scaffolding for this particular class that you get the opportunity to teach?
Yeah, it's great. So in frames, it's a little more of that academic side. We're going to read a couple different things about different approaches to thinking about technology and society. And then under the faithfulness, that's the areas that we're mostly thinking about, where we're saying, hey, let's think about the area of church. Let's think about the broader society. Let's think about our family and relationship structures, and let's think about us as individuals. And then the futures, we're talking about AI, transhumanism, and other topics that are upcoming. And when I ran the class maybe a couple of years ago, something like AI felt like a futuristic topic, and now that feels like a present topic. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily need to go in that futures bucket. But let me go back to frames for a minute and just mention there's like a couple of different approaches that you might take. So one discipline is media ecology. You might have heard of Marshall McLuhan or Neil Postman, or kind of godfathers of those areas. And they're using this idea of an ecosystem where there's, say, a bunch of different animals that eat each other, and there's the plants and there's the rivers and all that sort of stuff. And so they're thinking about media as an ecosystem. And when you add a new medium into an ecosystem, our lives change and wrap around that. Kind of like if you added a shark with a laser beam to a big fish tank, right? It would change things up. A little 90s reference there for you. And so you can't just add it and expect nothing to happen. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with our church. We think about it as potentially an ecosystem where if you add screens or speakers, that changes sort of the orientation and the way people are going to operate in that particular worship arena. So that's media ecology. And then philosophy of technology is approaching it a little bit more from a perspective of sort of what is technology, what is human being, how do they interact together, asking it from a more philosophical standpoint. And then over on the other side, there's sociology. That's more looking at data, of saying, how do people operate, and what can we draw out of that data? And how do we think of people as these sort of social organisms? So if we think about the Exodus account, and God gives them all of these new practices of this is the way you're to orient your life in a way of holiness. How does the group operate, not just the individual? And then I think the other one would be theology of let's look at the biblical story. Let's see where human making and creativity play a role, and where God started us in the garden, where we're going to this city that comes down from heaven. And so if we have each of those approaches, we in the classes read a little bit from each of them and then use those to then look at under the faithfulness, different areas of our lives, from us as individuals to churches to society.
That's fascinating.
That's really helpful. And we've mentioned a couple of different times this book that you've written with the title From the Garden to the City as a way of kind of summarizing maybe the story of Scripture as a whole. Right, yeah. But I'd love, maybe even just for someone who's not as familiar with that framework, I just walk us through maybe just briefly technology from the garden to the city. Why did you pick that title? Obviously, those are kind of the bookends of Scripture, but where do you see, there's text where you see early on in Genesis, like music or other kinds of things, kind of, this is right after kind of just outside of the garden, post murder of Cain or of Abel by Cain, and some of these early, but I wonder even in the garden itself, I just start us in the garden and take us to the city, maybe just in a...
So the title From the Garden to the City was this idea that when we look at Genesis 1, God makes men and women in his image and says, I want you to go make stuff. I want you to care for the garden, but I want you to make things from what I've made. And, Tolkien calls us sub-creators. There's all this lots of great development on that. But I think the expectation is that we're going to take the raw materials of the world and make things. And that as we care for the garden, that we're going to make bridges over rivers and all that sort of stuff. So that's our original calling. Sin comes in and messes that up. But when we zoom to the end of the story, we don't, go up to heaven as disembodied beings with maybe just a harp. But instead, God brings all the things we've made, roads and trumpets and banners, down to the earth. And it's fun to look at that and say, however we envision that, whatever our eschatological timeline is, it all ends with a new heavens and a new earth. And so that's this movement of garden to the city. Yeah. That was the title of it. If I was to summarize some of the ideas that I wanted to get into it, and then we'll go into it. Into it is, sometimes I'll ask the audience, like, do you think of technology as good, bad, or neutral?
Yeah. It's a great question.
And I'll give you some examples. What's that?
It's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll give some examples, try to prime the pump. And what I find is almost every time, like 5% will say it's good, and 5% will say it's bad, and 90% will say it's neutral. And I say, man, that's exactly what I had always thought until I really started to read in this a little bit. And the thesis of the book is that technology from a theological perspective is good, full stop. This is something that God gave us and made us as human beings to do, that we image God when we create and use technology. And yet it's never neutral. Yes. So whenever we use it, there's always some formative thing that's happening to us and to those around us. And so that's a starting point. Theologically good, never neutral in its usage. And so then I'm just walking through the story saying, at creation, God has again given us this great command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, not just with babies, but with things that we make. Yeah. And then, but then the fall happens. And I think even in the garden, you can see human beings, like their first instinct is to run and hide and then to make something. And so they make clothing to cover themselves. That's right. And then God comes along and he curses, and there's the curse of the ground, and there's the curse of the serpent, all this stuff. But right after he, promises to send a savior one day, he then comes and looks at their clothes and he's like, let me show you how to upgrade that. Let me show you how to make this better.
Yeah.
And that's one of his first acts. The really fascinating thing is when you look at it, when it says Adam and Eve, that they sewed fig leaves.
Yes.
Like, what were they using to sew?
How did that happen? Right.
Yeah, how did that happen? There's lots of questions in Genesis that we don't know, that it doesn't give us an answer to. But it is really fascinating to think, not only how long were they there and all the fun things, and did they have belly buttons, but like how in the world did they sew? That's what I want to know as a maker. So as we go through the story, you mentioned, there's Cain who goes off and kind of creates an anti-garden in a kind of way where he, amasses things around himself, and you see the creation of tools and music and agriculture, that technology we talked about earlier of a way of doing things, of a way of caring for animals. So all that comes out of a person that is against God, and it's sort of like he's trying to create a world where he's insulated from God and doesn't need him anymore. And as we go along, we could go through all the details. I think one of the most fascinating ones for us today is again the Sinai account when they make idols. Maybe we can come back to that. But I do think it's instructive too that as we move along and we get to Jesus, that Jesus is the one who has created us in his image, right? All things were made through the Son. And yet when he comes to earth, that we, the creation, turn on the creator, just literally we don't accept him. And then also that the technology with which he worked, wood and nails, is the very technology on which he dies. Mm-hmm. And so there at the center of the story is not this abstract idea or principle, but is, human making and human being right there in the middle of the story. And when we tell the gospel story, we can't tell it, but without this tool in the middle of it, the cross. We even sing songs about the old wooden cross, that it's so symbolically powerful to us. And all the fun stuff about, Paul and the Roman road and Koine Greek and all that stuff, that there were all these common things that allowed the gospel to go out, that becomes a big part of the New Testament church and so forth. And then again, we get to the end of the story, and God isn't ever saying, I want you to get rid of all the things that you've made. But a lot of the promises and the prophets, they have these things about taking, swords, these things that we made for destruction, not destroying them, but bending them into things that would promote human flourishing and goodness and what God originally commanded. So it's a redemptive movement, not a destructive movement.
It strikes me I hadn't thought about this until you were walking through that story, but even the cross itself as a execution technology becomes this like ultimate redemptive technology. I don't know if that's the right way to describe, but when you talk about plowshares into swords into plowshares, I mean, the cross itself as a execution technology, a technology for death, becomes the means of life. That's wow.
Well, and I've had never really quite thought about the sort of technological process of the sowing of fig leaves in terms of like one of the first acts after the fall, and how that maps to sort of your intro question for an audience of good, bad, or neutral, theologically good, designed for good, given to us to technology as a process of taking the raw materials and building it into something. So theologically good in the beginning, never neutral, and great potential for bad and harm. It was one of the first places they turned to try to deal with their shame. Yeah. And so I think we've just been, in many ways, like rehearsing and living out that story ever since, that we see in some of those first moments, even before God shows up to woo them back out of their shame. And of course, then he has to hand out curses. And so it really is one of these kind of consistent through lines there's just so much power in it as well. So,
and you mentioned idol making, and you said maybe we can come back to that, the golden cat. So I flagged that because I wanted to hear more there. So tell us where you're going to go there.
Yeah, I mean, so it would be so easy. I'm going to hold up a phone here for those of you who are just listening and say, hey, our phones are idols. And I think that that's true to some extent. But I think exploring what we mean by that is probably pretty important for us. And we've got John Calvin, and they're saying that the human heart is an idol-making factory, and that we're always doing that. But I love the moment in Exodus when the people have come out, they've been rescued, and Moses is up on the mountain, and he's up there getting all this great instruction. He's getting laws, and he's getting all kinds of practices, but he's up there a little bit for a long time. And so the people are sitting there going like, man, we had this way of life that made sense to us, and then everything changed, and now we feel like disconnected, because we're just out here in the desert, and life doesn't make sense. And so their instinct is to make an idol, right? So they take all their gold and they make this golden calf. And we think, golden calf is bad. But I think what's important to think about it is not just that they're worshiping a false god, but they're looking for something to orient their lives around. They're looking for something that will help make sense out of the chaos of the world. And, the chapter when they make it, the very next chapter is when Moses comes down. It's right there at the end where God appoints Bezalel, who's this kind of patron saint of making, to be the one who takes all these abstract principles that God has given Moses and to make them concrete, to give the people something that would orient them around the tabernacle. And there's smells and there's visuals and there's all these things that will embody holiness and embody that God is going to take away their sin and show them that on a daily and weekly basis. And they needed something like that. God knew that. And so he gave this to Moses, and he appoints a person. The very first time the Spirit of God comes on a person, it wasn't Abraham, it wasn't Moses, it's this maker, it's Bezalel. So I think God is validating that. And yet the Israelites, they can't wait just long enough to get it. So they have to make their own orienting thing. And I think that even though we're now 3 years away from the pandemic and all that sort of stuff, I think that's kind of what happened to us in a way. There's a sense that life made sense, and all of a sudden it just didn't make sense. And everybody was looking for things to make life make sense. If that was sourdough starters or Wordle games or whatever it was, people were trying to figure it out.
Ted Lasso.
Yeah, Ted Lasso. Yeah, whatever it is, something that will make life make sense. And I think that's what we're always doing, is we're trying to figure out, how do I make sense of this broad life? The problem is that I think we go toward like a default. So if you use your phone as your alarm clock in the morning, once that goes off, it's the thing that's right in front of you. So you're going to check the news or whatever. And as of this recording, the Rangers just won the World Series.
Yes.
Right? That was the big thing. And go Texas, all that stuff. I'm not a big sports guy, but I do know that one small fact.
You are in Texas, so you probably should know
exactly.
that.
So I do know that. But it brings us into this whole other world. And so I've got to choose to orient or to put the technology, to arrange it in such a way around me where I'm going to redirect my life toward the kind of life that I think God wants for me. But it is so easy to just fall into that, to not do that intentionally, and to just make a golden calf and not intentionally trying to worship something else, just trying to organize my life or just fall into the defaults of whatever the phone is showing me.
Well, and I'm fascinated by what happens actually with the piece of technology that they created. So Moses burns it down and makes them drink it. I mean, which in one sense is like kind of one of these details that you're like, oh, whoa, that's a lot. But there's something around like, I don't know, like like our relationship to humanity's relationship to technology, and like what's needed for like the great power within it, and like when it goes bad, it goes bad, but like the redemptive like possibility within the midst of it. I don't know. That's like a fascinating, like to think about that story through the lens of technology is really interesting. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many places in the prophets where they talk about, making these idols that can't really do anything for you. But I came across in Psalm 135 recently, I came across it and it says, those who make them will become like them.
Yeah.
And so will everyone who trusts in them.
Yeah.
Man, I'm going, that really summarizes it, that we become what we behold in some way, that we're always formed a little bit in that. And so we have to really make some active choices about, so what do I want to become? And how do I shape my life toward that end, toward sanctification in a theological sense, but also like if I want to have a relatively healthy body, I probably need to need to put the Halloween candy away because we're a little bit after Halloween as of this recording, and I need to have my tennis shoes out so I can go run. Right. But if I don't put it in front of me to behold that thing, then I'm probably going to become whatever is in front of me. So we want to be really careful about what we see and what's the most easily accessible thing.
Yeah, well, one of the questions actually kind of in line with that I know you use regularly, just a hook sort of question to get people thinking is, are you using technology or is technology using you? Which I think kind of gets at a lot of what we've been talking about. But as we think about even, you had the frames, faithfulness, and futures, and particularly around the power of technology to shape our lives and shape our humanity. As we're looking around the corner a little bit, I mean, you're mentioning AI as something that felt futures-oriented a few years ago, but is more present-oriented now. Like, what should Christians who want to think and live in a thoughtful way in this space, what should we be anticipating? What should churches be emphasizing? What are you seeing even maybe specifically within AI that you would want to, kind of bring shed some light on for our listeners? Just wondering about that as you're thinking about where we're heading and what thoughtful Christians can be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the AI movement that we're in right now is the generative AI stuff that really came out sort of the fall of 22 in some way. And so all the stuff from text generation to image generation, and then now, lots of the deep fake type videos are much, much easier to produce. There's really cool technology out there that can, translate your voice, not just having subtitles, but do all kinds of neat things. And that has wonderful ministry opportunities. But I do think that the fake world out there is what's coming, I think, in some ways. And so as we enter into, yet another election year in the U.S., I think there's just going to be a lot of that stuff out there that we should be really wary of. And I think this helps us to think, man, I really want to spend as much time on my local community, my literal neighbors in my neighborhood, the people in my church. I want to know more about them than I know about politicians and celebrities. And that requires a lot of hard, direct work to do. And if we spend just too much time online, we know that the generative AI is one thing, but really one of the most powerful AIs right now is just the algorithm of our social media feeds and what that's feeding us, and sort of the echo chambers that we can get into, all that stuff. I think most people have the same sort of political or theological opinions that they did 10 years ago. They just hold them with more virulence, with more anger, with more animosity, with more fear. And so we're further and further apart. And so I think I would be really cognizant to say, if you just find yourself like immediately reacting to things, that's something to really have a check on. It's almost like your mind goes into a script where you see this kind of message online and you have this immediate sense of what you should react to it. Man, that means you're being programmed in a certain kind of way, and ought to be really careful that if your response is what comes out of the heart or what comes out of the mouth is what's in the heart. I think what your reaction to those tweets are is something that's going on in your heart as well. And so we want to be really cognizant of those things. I do think there's a lot of, obviously with emergent technology, there's always some good uses of it. And I think it's really really fun to think about how we can use sort of Christian LLMs that give people a chance to dialogue and ask questions and do that. I think that's all wonderful technology.
LLM, that's a large language model, right? Is that word?
Yes. Yeah, you're right. I went a little nerd on you there.
Yeah.
Sorry. All the things like Chat GPT and all that stuff,
Yeah.
underlying technology, is sometimes this large language model, and there are people, training those on sort of theological documents so that you could ask it questions about what is the unforgivable sin and did I do it or whatever. Yeah. But the people that are doing that are finding that most of the people that are coming on those, they have theological questions, but they really have internal heart questions that they're really trying to struggle with. And they're just really trying to know, does anybody value me? Is God really there? And I think it's great that they're exploring that there is an avenue for it. But like the early online gospel presentations that people did great work on, eventually there was this movement of saying, now how do we connect this with a live person at some point? How do we connect them with a local community? And I think we're going to see that need in these AI models. But the last thing I think I would say is, as you're using them to generate content, that you ask this question of, again, what do I want to become? And if I want to become someone who can run a marathon, I have to do the work, right? And if I want to become someone who can write something, I have to do the work. And if I only use the generative tools there, eventually I lose that ability. So for example, I'm in Dallas. My sister lives in Fort Worth, and I do not know how to get to her house, even though I've been there multiple times, because I have ceded that ability to my Google Map program or whatever. And I just can't retain that ability to get there on my own. And so the question is, what are the things you want to be able to do on your own? Who do you want to be? And so I think as these tools emerge, we want to keep asking ourselves, do I want to have access to Scripture? Or do I want to have Scripture stored in my heart that I can bring out when I'm ready, and can I meditate on it? So those are the sort of questions I would ask, is not just the what can I do with it, but what will be changed about me as I use it.
Wow.
Yeah. That last example you gave, John, just as I think about my own life, I went to Bible college in 2001. So, certainly technology was available. I had an early Bible Works program when I was there. But I knew my physical Bible really, really well. And even now, even though I've read my Bible in many different forms for a long time, I find myself Googling references more than I probably, maybe it's just because I'm 40 now and I'm forgetting things, but where it's like, oh, if you would have, given a line, oh, that's Hebrews, 10, 15 or whatever, and could go on there. And now it's like, oh, what is that? But I think part of it is, I've got YouVersion in my pocket. And I can look. That's an interesting reflection of how that technology shapes, how we're connected in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And what resources might you recommend to listeners who are interested in, wanting to explore how to best equip themselves for just the continued emergence of more and more technologies, and how to respond in a Christianly, in a faithful way? Certainly, we've already mentioned a couple of times the second edition of your book, From the Garden to the City. That was good work to get into, because there's going to be multiple editions, I'm sure, forever and ever more as technology changes and shifts. But the first edition was 2011, and then just last year, 2022. Is that right? The second edition of your book. We'll have that linked in the show notes. I certainly want to give a strong recommendation to that. But any other resources or thinkers that you're appreciative of or would want to make our listeners aware of?
Yeah, I think the two that always come to mind for me, if my book is just a kind of a primer to thinking theologically and biblically about technology and some of the movements there, it's not super practical of like how to. And so two of the practical ones that stand out to me are Andy Crouch's work. He has this TechWise series. I think the TechWise family, just a really good framing of thinking about how do I organize my whole family in such a way that we are oriented toward our goals as a family of God and as an internal family. And that one's great. And then I think Justin Earley's work on the Common Rule is just a great set of formative practices, some things we want to deny ourselves in and some things we want to do that can orient our life. And I think it's got some great practices for families. He has a second one that's more directed toward families, and thinking again in terms of practices, not just don't do this and do this, but what are the patterns I want to form me in a particular direction? And then there's lots of great resources on individual topics, and so we could resource those, kind of newer books on AI and thinking a little bit more about, what does it mean when the robot can think, and what does that tell us about human persons? There's great work in that area. And then there's also
go ahead and share. I mean, dive in if you have recommendations off the top of your head to share. I certainly want those.
Yeah. I think my favorite deep thinker is Joshua K. Smith, who's a pastor in Mississippi. He's got a couple of great books on robots and persons that I think they're short chapters. They're really deep, but also really thoughtful that can move us in a particular direction. And then again, I can share with you a bunch of other ones that we could put in show notes. But those are the ones that come right away.
That's great. That's awesome.
It's really good. Yeah, I was thinking even in terms of what it means to sort of be human. I mean, I think one of the things, maybe the better way to say this is, I think one of the things that AI forces us to do is ask afresh the question, what does it mean to be human?
Yes.
And I'm actually really grateful for that. I think that is the question in so many ways, whether it's a question around gender or transgender.
It's always been the question.
Yeah, someone said the first 1,000 years of the church was, who's Jesus? The second 1,000 years, how are we saved? And that this next 1,000 years is going to be the question of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a human being? That's a gross oversimplification of church history, but I do think those three questions are really profound, and the AI conversation really does prompt in fresh ways. What does it mean to be human? So I'm eager to continue to see how thinkers and theologians and pastors respond to that question within the world of AI. As a part of our lives.
Well, and John, I'm interested. What initial thoughts would you offer to that? I mean, that's in some ways again a massive question, especially if the church is going to wrestle with it for the next 1,000 years. Yeah. But in light of kind of the emerging technology of AI, what would you say in terms of the opportunity we have to contribute to that big of a conversation about what it means to be human?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that we are always going to try to maybe answer it by negation, to say we're not God, so we're finite, and that tells us one thing about our technology is that as much as we want to know about we want to think through the implications of what we're going to make and do, we are not God, so we can't think through every implication. Some of it we have to learn, as we use it. Yeah. And so when a new technology comes along, I think we can't just say, oh, that might be bad. We have to, use it in community and talk about it together. And so that's one thing, that we're not like God, and we're also not like, other creatures in the world. We're different than animals. We have moral and vision, and we're made in the image of God, and so we want to rightly order our desires. If an animal just sort of goes after whatever it wants, we need to structure our wants and needs and desires in some different way, right? And then I think as we grow into adults, we're not children anymore. So there's an expectation of what a child will do, and that they're able to learn and experiment. But we need to have some type of leadership, and again, self-discipline, direction, community, and then I think we're not machines at the same time, and so we're not these inanimate objects. And to say that we have value apart from what we do, we have value for what we are, and I think that's probably the biggest difference there. Is that with a machine, we're always thinking is it fast enough? Is it good enough? But as we get older, we become less and less able. And so we grow in wisdom, but we decline in body. And so something about us has to be able to say that disabled person or that person that is really, really, really the absolute best, fastest, whatever, that Usain Bolt is made in the image of God, but not because he's fast, right? Because he's made in the image of God. So I think reclaiming each of those areas, sometimes by negation and sometimes by positive words, is going to be really important for us.
Yeah, that's 100%.
It's fascinating.
You want to take the last question?
Yeah. Well, one of the questions we always ask our guests at the end is just a kind of a get to know question in a way, but is to say, if you could do a different career, a different job, other than all the amazing things you've gotten to do as someone who's a maker and a theologian and a professor, but just if you could just live another life and get a chance to do something different, what would you do? I always say I'd love to be a park ranger, or more recently I've been saying research librarian. But if I could be a national park ranger, I would have loved that. Yeah. How would you answer that?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I kind of have two divergent ones that will then bring me back to who I am now. Okay. Is one side of it is I think man, I've gotten to work at a seminary for 20 years and it's great. What if I could just go all in at some type of startup, like in quantum computing or something like that? Just go all in. That'd be super fun. The other one I think of is that, when you watch British TV shows, There's always the guy with the collar, because that's sort of culturally what a pastor or priest is. And they're just kind of part of the community. In an American TV show, the pastor's always the bad guy, for sure. But in British shows, they're just kind of a character, right? And I think about that person, though, with that collar, stepping into a Starbucks and being that person you can just go up and talk to, that you sort of trust. And I feel like as an older person that might be a fun thing to do, to just kind of be a full-time person that someone could go talk to, that was sort of safe. And I think that's increasingly uncommon, that our trust in institutions, our trust in religion, and our just trust in people has gone down. And to try to push back against and rebend the universe back would be a really fun thing to do. And then also be better at making wood stuff. Which would be a fun thing. But right now I get to do a little bit of all those things, and just to be able to be a little bit more relaxed and do one of those things would be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, it's been super fun.
Oh man, this has been rich, and we will have a bunch of the resources listed off in the show notes, and we really appreciate our listeners for tuning into this episode on whatever piece of technology you listened to it on or watched it on. So we're grateful for it, and thanks again, John.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.